The three traps that hijack your peace. What if you could go through an entire day without anger, without resentment, without that tight knot in your chest that follows you from the moment someone cuts you off on the highway to the moment you finally collapse into bed? What if the rude comment from a colleague, the passive-aggressive text from a family member, the driver in Lagos traffic who nearly clips your side mirror at the Echo Bridge roundabout, what if none of it had the power to knock you off center? Most people would say that's impossible. Most people would say you'd have to be a monk, or emotionally numb, or simply lucky enough to live a life without friction. But what if the answer isn't about avoiding friction at all? What if it's about something far more profound, the realization that no one controls how you feel except you? That one idea, simple as it sounds, is the most liberating thing a human being can internalize. And yet most of us never learn it, not in school, not from our parents, not from years of grinding through relationships and careers and disappointments. We're handed tools for surviving the world, but rarely for surviving ourselves. This is what this series is about. Not a quick fix, not a list of tips you'll forget by tomorrow. This is a complete system, a way of thinking, feeling, and responding that, once it takes root, changes everything. We're going to begin with the source, because before you can rewire the way you respond to the world, you need to understand why you react the way you do in the first place. And the answer lies in three mental traps that quietly govern the emotional lives of most people on Earth. From a tech entrepreneur in Seoul to a schoolteacher in Nairobi, from a grandmother in Sao Paulo to a young professional in Amsterdam who checks his phone 37 times before noon. The first trap is called personalization. Imagine Amara, a project manager in Lagos. She sends a detailed report to her supervisor on a Friday afternoon. Monday comes and goes. Tuesday, nothing. By Wednesday, the silence has become deafening, not because it is loud, but because of the story Amara is writing inside her head. He's ignoring me on purpose. He didn't like what I wrote. Maybe he's already looking to replace me. Not once does she consider that her supervisor had a family emergency over the weekend. Not once does she remember that he mentioned his calendar was blocked through Thursday. The silence becomes about her, because we are wired to make everything about us. This is the personalization trap. When you interpret another person's behavior as a deliberate act directed at you, you hand them the remote control to your emotional state. And the cruelest irony is that most of the time, the other person isn't thinking about you at all. They're thinking about their mortgage, their health, their own mountain of worries. Their behavior is a reflection of their inner world, not a verdict on yours. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. A cab driver in Istanbul honks aggressively as you hesitate at an intersection, and you spend the next 3 minutes fuming, heart-pounding, replaying it as a personal insult. A colleague in Berlin doesn't smile during a team meeting, and you begin wondering what you said wrong last week. A friend in Tokyo cancels plans at the last minute, and suddenly you're drafting an emotional autobiography about how people never respect your time. Each of these reactions is built on the same faulty architecture, the assumption that someone else's action was primarily about you. When you depersonalize, when you start asking what might be going on in their world, instead of, what does this say about how they feel about me, the emotional charge dissolves almost immediately. The second trap is called the expectation trap. Somewhere in the course of growing up, most of us developed a very precise internal rule book for how the world should work. People should be punctual, conversations should be respectful, effort should be acknowledged, kindness should be returned. Drivers should use their indicators. People should hold the elevator door. These expectations aren't unreasonable in isolation. The problem is what happens when reality fails to comply. which it does, constantly and without apology. And every time reality deviates from your internal rule book, you experience frustration. Not because something genuinely harmful happened, but because the world failed to match the model in your head. Consider Hiroshi, a software engineer in Tokyo. He's meticulous, organized, precise. He believes meetings should start on time, that deadlines mean what they say, and that silence during a conversation is a form of communication, not emptiness. He has spent years adapting to a global workplace where not everyone shares these values. A colleague in São Paulo, who is perpetually 15 minutes late, drives him to quiet fury. A client in Sydney who responds to emails 2 days later, even when it's urgent, makes his blood pressure rise. Hiroshi isn't wrong that punctuality and responsiveness are virtues, but he is locked in a war he cannot win, fighting to impose his internal rulebook onto people whose rulebooks were written by completely different cultures, families, and nervous systems. Every day he goes to battle. Every day he loses. Every day he goes to bed a little more exhausted and a little more hardened. The antidote to the expectation trap is not to abandon all standards. It's to hold your preferences lightly, to distinguish between what you value and what you demand. You can want people to be on time while also accepting that they often won't be. You can prefer respectful communication while recognizing that stress, culture, and personality will sometimes produce something very different. The moment you loosen the expectation from a law to a preference, you free yourself from the emotional penalty that comes every time it's violated. The third trap is the control trap, and it may be the most seductive of the three. There is a deeply human belief that if you feel strongly enough, if you express your displeasure loudly enough or consistently enough, things will change, that your anger is a lever, that your frustration is a tool, that if you're upset enough, the world will eventually rearrange itself to accommodate your peace. It won't. Think of Elena, a restaurant owner in Athens, managing a team of 12 people with very different temperaments. One of her staff members, a young server named Costas, keeps making the same mistakes on orders despite repeated corrections. Elena's response, each time, has been to raise her voice, to express her exasperation visibly, to make it clear through every signal available to her that this behavior is unacceptable. Costas, for his part, has become increasingly anxious and defensive. His mistakes haven't decreased. They've actually increased because anxiety is not a performance enhancer. Elena's anger has created a feedback loop of stress, not a pathway to improvement. The control trap convinces us that our emotional reactions are capable of changing other people's behavior. But in almost every case, expressed anger or frustration either pushes people into defensiveness, silences them into superficial compliance, or simply entrenches their existing patterns. The only behavior you can reliably change is your own. Here's what's most important about these three traps. They don't operate in isolation. They form a cycle. You personalize an event, which generates a rigid expectation about how it should have gone, which leads you to believe that expressing your frustration will force a correction. Around and around it goes, each rotation a little more draining than the last. Breaking the cycle requires something deeper than technique. It requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your relationship to the world around you. Emotional maturity begins the moment you genuinely accept that the world is not organized around you, that other people's behavior is largely the output of their own inner weather, not a message intended for your inbox. It begins when you recognize that your preferences are not laws of nature, and it deepens when you understand that emotional explosions are not educational tools. When that understanding lands, really lands, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a lived recognition. Something shifts. The emotional static begins to quiet. You stop bracing for offense at every turn. You stop scanning every interaction for signs of disrespect. You stop deputizing your own nervous system to police the behavior of 7 billion other people. That shift is called emotional independence, and it is the foundation of everything that follows. If what you're reading is landing for you, if something in these words is already loosening something that's been tight for a long time, consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment below. Let us know what resonated. Your engagement is what makes it possible to keep building this kind of content. Thank you, genuinely. Now, let's go deeper. Understanding the biology of emotional reaction makes everything else easier to apply. When your brain's amygdala, the ancient alarm system buried deep in your temporal lobe, detects what it perceives as a threat, it acts before the thinking part of your brain even gets a word in. Adrenaline floods your system. Cortisol follows. Your heart accelerates. Your muscles tighten. Your visual field narrows. Your peripheral awareness shrinks. This entire cascade takes milliseconds. This system was designed to keep your ancestors alive, to register a shadow in the tall grass and launch the body into protective action before the conscious mind could deliberate. It is extraordinarily effective at what it was built to do. The problem is that the amygdala cannot tell the difference. The amygdala cannot tell the difference between a predator and a passive-aggressive comment from your sister-in-law. It treats both as threats. And when it fires, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, empathy, long-range planning, is effectively taken offline. This is why you've said things you immediately regretted. This is why conversations escalate to places no one intended. The rational brain returns online a few seconds or minutes later, surveys the wreckage, and asks, "How did we get here?" Here is the crucial piece of hope. The hijacking can begin automatically, but it is not inevitable. There is a gap, and in that gap lives your power. The first skill is recognizing your body's early warning system. Before the volcano erupts, there are always signals. Your breath becomes shallow, your jaw tightens, your hands clench slightly, your face warms. The internal monologue accelerates. These are precise, personal, and, once you learn to read them, incredibly useful. This is where the pause protocol enters. The pause protocol is the deliberate insertion of a small gap between stimulus and response, just enough space to let the rational brain reassert itself. 3 slow breaths, stepping out of the room, counting to 10. These are not cliches, they are neurophysiological interventions. Specifically, the extended exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system and begins to counteract the stress response. But here is something most people miss. The pause protocol is not just for emergencies. It is a practice. Applying the pause in small, low-stakes situations, waiting in line at a coffee shop in Melbourne, sitting in slow traffic on the N3 highway in Johannesburg, typing a response to a mildly irritating message, builds the neural pathway that makes it available automatically in high-pressure moments. One more thing that needs to be said clearly. Pausing is not the same as suppressing. It is about acknowledging what's arising and then choosing how to act in alignment with your values rather than your reactivity. The difference between a reaction and a response is that gap. Reframing, emotional independence, and the architecture of boundaries. There is a second skill that works alongside the pause, and it may be even more transformative over the long term. It is called reframing, and it addresses something the pause alone cannot touch: the stories you tell yourself about what just happened. Consider 2 people sitting in the same delayed train in Frankfurt. One man, Marcus, a compliance officer heading to an important meeting, immediately begins narrating the situation as a catastrophe, as proof that the transportation system is fundamentally broken, as something happening specifically to him because the universe is conspiring against his career. He paces, his chest tightens. He arrives at his meeting 20 minutes late and 20 emotional degrees hotter than he should be. A few seats away, Seelan, a translator who has learned through years of working across cultures that timelines are suggestions, pulls out her notebook and uses the unexpected gap to draft 3 paragraphs she'd been struggling with all week. She arrives slightly late, genuinely unbothered, and completes one of her best pieces of work in months. Same train, same delay, same objective facts, completely different inner experiences. The difference is not temperament, it's the meaning each person assigned to the event. Reframing is not positive thinking. It is the recognition that in most ambiguous situations, multiple interpretations are available, and that the one you choose determines not just how you feel in the moment, but how effectively you respond. When someone doesn't return your message for 2 days, there are at least 4 plausible interpretations. They're ignoring you on purpose. They're overwhelmed and drowning in their own backlog. They never saw the message amid a flood of others. Or they're dealing with something personal they haven't mentioned. The interpretation of deliberate snub generates anger. The interpretation of human bandwidth generates patience. Which is more useful? Which is more likely to actually be true? There are several reframing lenses that prove particularly powerful in daily life. The ignorance frame, perhaps they simply don't know better. The pain frame, perhaps they are hurting. The difference frame, perhaps they are operating by a completely different cultural code. The impermanence frame, this moment is not a verdict. Today's difficulty is not tomorrow's permanent condition. These lenses don't require you to abandon discernment or excuse genuine wrongdoing. They require only that you stop assuming the worst interpretation is the most accurate one. Above these individual skills, there is a larger principle that holds everything together. It is called emotional independence, and understanding it properly changes the entire game. Emotional independence has 3 interlocking pillars. The first is emotional self-sufficiency. This means that the validation, affirmation, and sense of worth you need do not have to arrive from outside you before you can access them. It is wonderful to be appreciated. It is genuinely satisfying to be recognized. But your sense of value cannot be held hostage to whether or not those things arrive on schedule. Think of Fatima, a mid-level manager at a multinational company in Dubai. She is extraordinarily competent. Her results speak clearly. But for years, she has measured her performance through the feedback of her direct supervisor. On days he praises her work, she is energized. On days he is distracted or critical, she spirals into self-doubt that follows her home and clouds her judgment the next morning. Her competence has become held hostage to one person's daily emotional state. Emotional self-sufficiency doesn't mean Fatima stops wanting recognition. It means she stops needing it to function. The recognition becomes a bonus rather than a lifeline. The second pillar is independence from outcomes. You put effort into something meaningful. The outcome may or may not reflect that effort, because outcomes depend on countless variables beyond your behavior. Emotional independence means your internal state is not held captive by the result. The third pillar is independence from identity. What you do is not who you are. The roles you inhabit, the job title, the relationship status, the social identity, are not the core of you. When you have fused your identity with your performance, any critique of your work feels like an attack on your personhood. But when you maintain a distinction between what you do and who you are, feedback becomes information rather than assault. Now, none of this emotional architecture can be sustained without the additional structure that we often don't talk about enough: healthy boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are the invisible but essential lines that define where your emotional responsibility ends and someone else's begins. Your emotions are yours to carry. Your challenges are yours to navigate. When you take on someone else's emotional burden, absorbing their anxiety, their guilt, their expectations, their moods as your own, you exhaust yourself without actually helping them. Compassion with detachment is the goal. You can care deeply about someone while refusing to be subsumed by their emotional state. You can offer support while maintaining your own center of gravity. In practice, this looks like knowing how long a conversation can run before it starts costing you more than you can afford. It looks like being able to say, "I'm not available for this right now," without shame or lengthy justification. It looks like distinguishing between a genuine request and an emotional manipulation. It looks like saying no with the same ease and warmth with which you say yes. Clutter has a measurable cognitive cost. A disordered environment creates a low-grade background sense of incompletion, a subtle but persistent signal that things are unresolved, which your nervous system interprets as mild threat. Simplifying your physical space isn't aesthetics, it's neurology. Energy is the invisible foundation of emotional management. Without adequate energy, even the most sophisticated emotional intelligence dissolves. The prefrontal cortex, the very part of the brain responsible for calm, measured response, is the first region to reduce function when the body is depleted. Poor sleep, erratic nutrition, chronic sedentary behavior. These are not just physical problems, they are emotional regulation problems. Good sleep is not a luxury. 7 to 9 hours of consistent sleep for most adults is the baseline from which emotional mastery operates. When a human being is sleep-deprived, the amygdala becomes measurably more reactive. The world genuinely feels more threatening when you haven't slept. Nutrition has a more direct effect on emotional regulation than most people realize. Blood glucose dysregulation, the swings that come from skipping meals, overconsumption of refined sugar, or heavy caffeine reliance, creates physiological conditions almost indistinguishable from anxiety. Stable blood sugar is, among other things, a mood stabilizer. And movement, regular, consistent physical movement, is one of the most potent anti-anxiety interventions available to any human being, entirely free, without side effects, and accessible in almost any context. A 5-minute walk in the middle of a tense workday is not a break from productivity, it is a contribution to it, rewiring the brain, the inner voice, and the skill of mental distance. Emotional balance is not a destination you reach and then inhabit forever. It is a practice, an ongoing, daily, sometimes tedious practice that eventually becomes so woven into how you move through the world that it stops feeling like effort. What makes this practice possible at a biological level is one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the last 30 years: neuroplasticity. Your brain is not fixed. The patterns that currently govern your emotional responses, the hair-trigger reactions, the personalization, the catastrophizing, these are not personality traits you were born with. They are neural pathways that were built by repetition and reinforced over time, and what repetition built, repetition can rebuild. Every single time you pause instead of reacting, every time you reframe instead of catastrophizing, every time you choose a considered response over an automatic explosion, you are forging a new pathway. And over time, with enough consistent repetition, the new pathway becomes the path of least resistance. 3 conditions accelerate this rewiring. The first is consistency. Random, occasional application of these tools produces random, occasional results. Daily practice, even imperfect, even brief, is exponentially more effective than occasional heroic effort. The second is emotional depth. Engaging the felt sense, the actual bodily experience of what calm feels like, accelerates learning. The third is variety. Practicing across different environments, with different people, in different types of pressure builds a transferable skill rather than a context-specific habit. Mental rehearsal is a powerful and underused tool. Each morning before the day begins, you can spend 5 minutes vividly imagining a situation that typically triggers you, and rehearsing in detail, remaining calm. Not just the visual image, but the physical sensation, the deep breath, the loosening of the jaw, the slowing of the internal monologue, the deliberate choice of a measured response. Your brain cannot fully distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. It codes both as learning. Now let's talk about something that lives at the very center of your emotional life: the voice inside your head. There is a continuous narrative running in your mind, day and night, interpreting events, assigning meanings, predicting futures, evaluating your performance. This inner voice is not neutral. For most people, it is the most powerful emotional influence in their lives, and it often operates completely below the threshold of conscious awareness. Think about what your inner voice said the last time you made a mistake. Did it say something a good mentor might say? Calm, specific, focused on what could be learned? Or did it say something you would never say to someone you loved? Most people's inner critics are savagely more harsh than they would be with any other human being. They speak with a certainty and a cruelty that would be unacceptable coming from anyone else. And they do so constantly, without accountability, without the possibility of argument. Consider Amara again, our project manager in Lagos. After a presentation that went reasonably well, her inner voice spends the evening reconstructing the moment when she stumbled over a transition, magnifying it, replaying it, assigning it the weight of evidence. Evidence of inadequacy, evidence that people saw through her. None of that is true. None of it is accurate. But the inner voice doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about pattern. Here is what's critical to understand. The brain treats words as real. The threat response triggered by "I'm about to fail" is neurologically similar to the threat response triggered by a physical danger. The inner voice is not just commentary, it is programming. The first step in changing this is the most important: noticing that the voice exists and creating distance from it. Instead of "I failed," learning to observe "my mind just generated a thought about failure." That single shift from fused belief to observed thought is one of the most powerful interventions in the entire field of cognitive psychology. When you are the thought, you are compelled to act on it. When you observe the thought, you have a choice. The second step is reframing the internal narrative. "I'll never be able to handle this" becomes "I'm finding this genuinely challenging right now." "Nobody takes me seriously" becomes "I'm not getting the recognition I'd like, but that doesn't define my value." The third step is intentionally building a new inner vocabulary, one that speaks to you the way the wisest, most compassionate version of yourself would. Short, clear, honest statements that reflect the kind of thinking you want to inhabit. Not affirmations plastered over genuine doubt, but gradual reconstructions of the default lens through which you see yourself. Now let's address a skill that is quietly central to everything: the skill of mental distance. Mental distance is the capacity to experience events without being consumed by them. It is the difference between being in the water and drowning in it. You feel what's happening. You don't disappear into it. Most people, when something difficult occurs, immediately fuse with the event. They become the frustration, the injustice, the disappointment. There is no separation between themselves and what's happening to them. This is why small things can derail entire days. Mental distance is the cultivation of an observer, a part of consciousness that can watch what's happening with curiosity rather than emergency. It doesn't detach you from your feelings. It gives you room to feel them without being governed by them. The metaphor I find most useful is this. Imagine you're standing in a river and the current is strong. If you try to fight it directly, you exhaust yourself and often get pulled under. But if you can find a stable rock, something to stand on that isn't the current itself, you can watch the water move around you without being swept away. Mental distance is that rock. In practical terms, this means learning to say, I notice that I'm feeling frustrated, rather than I'm frustrated. That one-word shift, from identity to observation, creates just enough space for choice to enter. Developing mental distance has enormous consequences for your relationships. When someone you love says something that lands badly, your first response without mental distance is almost always defensive. With mental distance, that tiny pause, that observer perspective, you can feel the impact clearly, name it internally, and then ask, what is actually happening here? Is this truly an attack? Or is this a person who is tired or scared or poorly expressing something legitimate? Developing this capacity requires daily practice, a few minutes each morning or evening of simply sitting with your thoughts, watching them arise, noting their quality, letting them pass, without the compulsion to act on them, argue with them, or escape them. It is quiet work. It compounds invisibly. And then one day you notice that something which would once have derailed your afternoon has moved through you like weather, leaving you intact. The body's wisdom, social intelligence, and the transformation of conflict. Everything we've explored so far has lived primarily in the domain of the mind, thoughts, interpretations, neural pathways, inner narratives. But there is a dimension of emotional mastery that cannot be accessed through thinking alone. It lives in your body. The mind and body are not two separate systems that occasionally communicate. They are one integrated system, in constant conversation. Emotions do not originate in the mind and then travel down to the body for processing. They arise in the body, in the tightening of the diaphragm, in the heat across the face, in the clenching of the hands, and they send information upward. The mind interprets and amplifies, but the body is where it all begins. Learning to read your body's early signals is one of the most practical emotional skills you can develop. The average person doesn't notice that they're becoming emotionally activated until it's already advanced, until the voice has already risen, the door has already been slammed, the words already said. But the body's warning system operates well in advance of the visible eruption. Daniel is a family physician in Nairobi. He works under relentless pressure, patient overload, administrative demands, a healthcare system perpetually straining against its own edges. Over years of practice, he has learned to identify the precise physical sequence that precedes his own loss of composure. First, a subtle tightening across the back of his shoulders, then a shortening of his breath, then a faint warmth in the center of his chest. Learning those three signals changed everything for Daniel, not because they prevented the stress, but because they gave him a window. 5 seconds between recognition and response in which he could consciously intervene. 5 seconds is not a lot, but 5 seconds is everything. The breath deserves special attention because it is the only function of the autonomic nervous system that operates both automatically and voluntarily. Specifically, extended exhalation activates the parasympathetic branch, the branch responsible for calm, recovery, and rest. Inhaling for 3 or 4 counts and Exhaling for 6 to 8 counts creates a biochemical environment that is literally incompatible with high-level emotional reactivity. You can do this on a subway in Buenos Aires. You can do this in a difficult meeting in Singapore. You can do this in the middle of a challenging conversation with your partner so subtly that they don't notice. It requires no equipment, no retreat, no special conditions. It just requires knowing it works and doing it anyway. Posture is another body-based lever that most people underestimate. Collapsed posture, hunched shoulders. These create biochemical conditions associated with threat and diminishment. An open posture, with shoulders back and down, chest released, spine lengthened, generates measurably different biochemistry. This is not a power pose performance for the mirror. It's a genuine physiological intervention available at any moment. Movement, particularly rhythmic, sustained movement outdoors, is one of the most potent mood regulation tools available. A 15-minute walk after a difficult interaction doesn't just burn off adrenaline, though it does that. It also synchronizes the two hemispheres of the brain, which become desynchronized during high stress. That synchronization is associated with calm, clarity, and perspective. Now let's move to social intelligence, simultaneously the most interpersonally complex and the most transformative dimension of emotional mastery. Social intelligence begins with the recognition that human communication is mostly not what's being said. Studies across cultures consistently find that the majority of interpersonal meaning is conveyed through tone, pace, volume, facial expression, posture, and what's not said. Focusing only on the words is like watching a film with the sound off and the subtitles on. You get some of the content but none of the music. Consider Yui, a conflict resolution specialist working across corporate clients in Tokyo and Sydney. In a mediation session, she watches a senior executive describe himself as completely comfortable with a proposed restructuring while simultaneously straightening his jacket 3 times, breaking eye contact when the timeline is mentioned, and speaking slightly faster than his baseline. She opens a space. Is there a part of this timeline you'd like more time to sit with? He exhales visibly. The real conversation begins. Understanding that behavior has underlying drivers is the next layer. Most difficult behavior is not freely chosen cruelty. It is the output of unmet needs for safety, for recognition, for autonomy, for connection. The colleague who dominates every conversation is often driven by an unexamined fear of irrelevance. The family member who consistently criticizes is often someone whose own sense of inadequacy has never been addressed. This doesn't excuse the behavior, it contextualizes it. Cultural intelligence is a particularly important component in an increasingly interconnected world. What communicates competence in one culture signals arrogance in another. Directness is a virtue in parts of Northern Europe and a form of aggression in other parts of the world. Understanding that your interpretation of behavior is always culturally filtered prevents a staggering amount of unnecessary interpersonal friction. Conflict is, of course, inevitable. What is not inevitable is the suffering and relational damage that typically accompanies it. Most people approach conflict as a zero-sum competition. One person wins, one person loses. The goal is to establish that you are right and the other person is wrong. This approach virtually guarantees that both parties leave the interaction either damaged or deeply unsatisfied, and it almost never resolves the underlying issue. The alternative is to understand conflict not as a battle over positions, but as an exploration of needs. Positions are what people say they want. Needs are why they want it. And when you address the need rather than arguing against the position, something remarkable becomes possible. A couple, Maria Jose and Tariq, living in Barcelona after years of separate lives in Casablanca and Madrid, argue repeatedly about how to spend their annual vacation. She wants the sea. He wants the mountains. They fight about destinations. But when they finally talk about what they need, not what they want, but what they need, they realize that Maria Jose needs unstructured time in nature, and Tariq needs physical engagement with a landscape. A walking trip along a coastal trail in Portugal gives both of them exactly what they actually needed. The fight was about the positions. The resolution lived in the needs. Validating emotion before pursuing solution is one of the most powerful and consistently underused tools in conflict resolution. When someone feels strongly about something and you immediately move to problem solving, they feel unheard. And an unheard person escalates, not cooperates. I can see this really matters to you creates the conditions in which resolution becomes possible. Validation is not agreement. You can acknowledge that someone's anger is real without conceding that their interpretation of events is accurate. Language matters enormously in conflict. Accusatory language, you always, you never, you deliberately, reliably triggers defensiveness. Replacing accusatory language with observational language, I noticed, I felt. What I experienced was, keeps the channel open. Calm is contagious. Safety invites honesty. A person who maintains their center in the middle of another person's storm often finds that the storm begins to lose energy simply because it is no longer being fed. This is not strategy. It is physics. Inner voice, mastery, meaning, values, and the lifelong practice. We've traveled a significant distance together. We've looked at the mental traps that keep most people emotionally reactive. We've examined the neuroscience of the stress response and the physiology of calm. We've explored reframing, boundaries, energy, the body's intelligence, and the deep architecture of conflict resolution. Now we arrive at the deepest layer, the one that either anchors everything above it or, in its absence, allows it all to drift away. This layer is about meaning. Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps partly by maintaining the capacity to find meaning even in conditions of absolute horror. His observation, which he developed into a full therapeutic tradition called logotherapy, was simple and radical. Everything can be taken from a human being except the freedom to choose how they respond to what is happening to them. Emotional resilience at its deepest level is not a collection of coping techniques. It is an orientation toward life, a fundamental relationship with existence that determines whether challenges are experienced as threats or as catalysts. A person without a clear sense of purpose is like a ship without ballast. When the weather is calm, it moves forward fine. When the storm comes, and it always comes, there is nothing to prevent capsizing. A person with a strong sense of purpose can be battered by exactly the same storm and maintain their course. Not because the storm is less severe, because something inside them is providing counterweight. Purpose does not have to be grandiose. It does not require a global mission. For many people, purpose lives in the daily texture of specific commitments, raising children who feel genuinely seen, performing a craft with care and integrity, being the kind of neighbor or friend or colleague that other people can actually rely on. The content matters less than the sincerity, whether it's chosen from the inside, not imposed from the outside. Think of Kwame, a documentary filmmaker from Accra, now based in London after years of working across West Africa, South Asia, and Eastern Europe. His films rarely find large commercial audiences. There have been years of genuine financial pressure, of watching colleagues achieve more conventional success. There have been nights he doubted everything, But Kwame has never doubted why he makes films. He makes them because there are stories being lived by people who will never otherwise be seen. And he believes, with a conviction that doesn't require external validation, that being seen matters. That purpose is not separate from his emotional resilience. It is the spine of it. When a project fails, it is disappointing. When a funding application is rejected, it is frustrating. But these setbacks do not threaten his identity, because his identity is not the project or the funding. It is the purpose behind both. Values work in a similar way. They are the operating system beneath the applications, the deep code that determines how you actually behave when the convenient options run out. When you haven't consciously identified and internalized your values, the pressures of each moment make decisions for you. You end up reactive, inconsistent, and vaguely ashamed of choices that didn't feel like yours. A few questions are worth sitting with seriously, not answering quickly, but letting breathe over days or weeks. What do I actually believe, independent of what I've been told to believe? What would I refuse to compromise, even under considerable pressure? What kind of person do I want to be? Not in terms of achievements, but in terms of character. The answers to these questions are your values, not the answers that sound impressive, the honest answers. The practice of acceptance deserves its own moment here. Acceptance is consistently misunderstood. It is not resignation. It is not endorsement. It is not the abandonment of effort or aspiration. Acceptance is the recognition that reality is what it is right now, and that your refusal to acknowledge what it is costs you energy without changing it. The Stoics understood this with extraordinary clarity 2,000 years ago. Marcus Aurelius, governing the Roman Empire while managing barbarian incursions on multiple fronts, returned repeatedly in his private journals to the same distinction: what lies within our control and what does not. His emotional equanimity, remarkable given the objective severity of his circumstances, was built almost entirely on this distinction. He poured his energy into what was his to effect. He released as cleanly as he could what was not. Flexibility is acceptance's companion. Rigid systems break under sufficient stress. Flexible systems bend and recover. The mind that holds its model of the world loosely, that can revise, adapt, and reorient when circumstances demand, is not weak. It is capable of something the rigid mind never is: thriving in uncertainty. Now, all of this must eventually become habitual, not unconscious, because mastery is never fully automatic, but woven into the fabric of daily life rather than being something you have to remember to do. Begin the day with intention rather than stimulation. The reflexive reach for the phone, the flood of news, notifications, opinions, and conflicts before you've had a moment to locate yourself, is one of the most reliable ways to start the day in a reactive rather than a centered state. Even 5 minutes of quiet, a conscious breath, a brief moment of asking what kind of person you want to be today, sets a different neurological tone for everything that follows. Practice the pause, not occasionally, but constantly. The small frictions of ordinary life are not annoyances to be eliminated. They are training opportunities. Each one is a chance to practice the pause, to practice reframing, to practice the mental distance that makes a considered response possible. Review the day in the evening with honesty and compassion. Not a performance review, not a verdict. A genuine inquiry. When did I stay centered? When did I lose it? What was different between those moments? What would I do differently? This kind of reflection, without self-punishment, accelerates learning dramatically. Teach what you're learning. The most reliable way to deepen your own understanding of something is to explain it to someone else. A friend who is struggling, a child who is overwhelmed by their own emotions, a partner who is stuck in the same reaction loop. When you offer what you know with humility and genuine care, you reinforce your own practice. Most importantly, remain compassionate with yourself throughout this process. Emotional mastery is not a state you achieve and then maintain without effort. It is a direction, one that you move in more consistently over time, but from which you will deviate often and sometimes spectacularly. The measure of your development is not whether you ever lose your composure. It is how quickly you notice when you do and how gracefully you return to center. What emerges from sustained practice in all of this is not a personality transformation. It is something subtler and more durable, a different relationship with your own experience. You still feel everything: the frustration, the disappointment, the anger, the grief, the anxiety. These are not eliminated. They were never meant to be. Emotions are information. They point toward what you value, what you fear, what you need, what matters to you. What changes is that you are no longer governed by them. The frustration arises, moves through you, and informs a response, without becoming the response. The anger arrives, delivers its message about a boundary that has been crossed, and waits for you to decide what to do about it, rather than simply exploding out of you before any decision can be made. The distance between feeling and acting is where your freedom lives. Think again of Marcus Aurelius, managing an empire and a chronic illness and a court full of intrigue, and writing in his private journal for no audience but himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wrote that 16 centuries before the science of neuroplasticity confirmed what he already understood, that the mind shapes its own experience. You have power over your mind, not over the traffic in Mumbai or the mood of your supervisor in Zurich, or the choices your adult children make, or the pace of change in an industry that isn't waiting for your readiness. Not over the illness that arrives without an invitation, or the relationship that ends before you were prepared to let it. You have power over how you receive all of that. You have power over the story you assign to it. You have power over the breath you take before you respond. You have power over the words you choose and the tone you carry them in. You have power over whether this moment defines you, or whether you define this moment. That power, modest on its surface, enormous in its implications, is the whole point of everything we've explored. The world will continue to be exactly as complicated as it is. Other people will continue to be exactly as human as they are. Circumstances will continue to surprise, disappoint, and sometimes devastate. None of that is changing. What is changing, what is already changing, for anyone who reads words like these with genuine openness, is the relationship you have with all of it. Emotional resilience is not a finish line. It is not a state you reach and then inhabit safely forever. It is a direction, chosen again every morning, practiced in the 10,000 small moments between waking and sleeping, deepened by every return to center after every inevitable departure. The practice does not end. The person it is making you into never stops becoming. You cannot control others. But the moment you control your reaction, you are free. Peace doesn't begin when the world fixes itself. It begins when you stop waiting for it to.